So now if I go to this first bullet again, we've gone over all the parts. We've gone over the fact that there's guidance interpretations here. Now let's go back to the compliance review, right? That's when the feds are going to go knock on your door, kick the can around, right? Here's the problem with that. When I scroll down here, this is everything about the rating process. So again, a safety audit, pass or fail. A compliance review, pass or fail. This explains everything you need to know if the feds come in for a safety audit and a compliance review, right? So what I'll do is I'll just shrink these down again so you can kind of see the bottom as it goes through this process, right? All right, so when I go down to this table of contents and I scroll down to the way bottom, it's got an explanation of the safety audit criteria. Well, that's the audit that you get within 18 months. Then it has an explanation of compliance review safety rating process. So I said the feds are going to come knock on your door if you have bad CSA scores. I said the feds are going to come knock on your door if you get a complaint. They're going to come knock on the door if they have a bad crash, or if you hire a driver that's got an issue. Those are the four major reasons. So now when I click on this safety rating process, it basically explains what's going to get me in trouble during a review. So when I scroll down right here, all the way to the bottom to Roman numeral 7, that's where I'm headed, is down to 7, because we're going to start there. Right here, a list of acute or critical regulations. You see that? Now, you can violate those parts I talked about that were in the middle of the page of the internet. You can violate those, but not all those violations are going to hurt your rating. Now, what are the 4 ratings when the feds come knock on your door? Satisfactory, non-rated, conditional, and unsatisfactory. What's the best rating? There's argument that satisfactory and non-rated are both equal. A lot of brokers and receivers and shippers think that satisfactory is better than non-rated. The only way to get a satisfactory rating is to have a full review where they check all the parts of a compliance review. If they do a focus review where they only check a few things and not everything, you can't end up with a satisfactory rating. You can only get a non-rated rating. So in essence, the only way to get a full satisfactory rating in today's world is to get a full review from the feds. If you've never had a review, meaning your CSA is good, you don't get any complaints, you don't have any bad crashes, and you don't hire any drivers to come prompt a visit, you may end up non-rated for your whole life. So full reviews are SAT. If you have violations in categories that I'm going to outline here in a minute, and you have too many of those, you can end up with a conditional or an unsat rating. That's where these acute and criticals come in. What is an acute? Acute is a violation that you do wrong one time. Example, let's say that a driver tests positive for marijuana or heroin or cocaine or something. And the MRO contacts you and says, hey, you got Jim Bob who tested positive. Well, he's in Texas heading his way back to Wisconsin. And you say, you know what? It's a pain to pull him out of the truck. It's a pain to do all that. I'm just going to have him drive back and I'm going to fire him when he gets back. Well, the problem is when the feds come in, they'll get notification when the MRO called you at noon. Well, the driver drove all the way back here and you terminated him when you got back here. That's knowingly using a positive driver. You need to pull that driver out immediately upon notification. You can't get notified of a test and then let him drive back. You got to take him out now. Well, that's inconvenient. Uber, getting a new driver there, the load stuck on the side of the road. I'll tell you what though, ELDs will sink your ship. So if you knowingly use a positive driver by letting them come back even after notified, you'd be violating 382.215 right here. That's an acute violation. You do this one time and that's one step to a bad rating. So that's acute. One time wrong, right? Critical regulations. How does that work? They have something called a sample size. The sample size that you have depends on the size of your company. Bigger companies have larger sample sizes. Smaller companies have smaller sample sizes. So for example, let's say that you have a company with 9 drivers, 9. They'll come in and check logs, but the sample size is 5 drivers. If you only have 9 drivers, they're going to check 5 of them. They're required to check 30 days for each of those 5. Well, what's the math? 5 drivers times 30 days is 150 days. They're going to look at 150 days logbooks for those 5 people. If they look at hours of service violations that are considered critical in nature, and you have more than a 10% violation rate, they're going to make you critical in that category of violation. For example, let's say that you have 5 drivers times 30 days, it's 150 days. 10% or more violation rate is considered critical. If you're only at 7%, it's not. If you're at 20%, it is. So what is 10% of 150? 15. So if you have 15 false logbooks that meet the critical threshold, 15 false logs that meet the critical threshold in that 150 days check, you're going to have a critical violation in hours of service for false logbooks. Let's say your logs aren't false, but your drivers never take 30-minute breaks. Well, then you're going to be missing 30-minute breaks a bunch of times. Well, if you're missing 15 or more 30-minute breaks out of that 150, then you're over 10% and you're critical. The more criticals and the more acutes you get, the more likely it is that you're going to end up conditional or unsat. So let's scroll down. See how this says 382, 382, 382? This highlighted section, every 382, based on what we discussed earlier, are drug testing violations. So all these I highlighted in blue are drug testing issues that are either acute and critical that'll give you a bad rating if the feds come in and find you in violation too much. That's just the drug testing stuff. This is driving on the road and doing something wrong. Drinking, on drugs, things like that. Now, here's the big one. This is why I skipped it before. These are all the acute and critical hours of service violations. You see how many there are? What is the most likely thing that's going to drive you to a bad rating? Your logbooks. I'll say it 100 times. Logbooks are the majority reason that you're going to end up in a bad rating situation. What's 393 and 396? That's maintenance. So that's all maintenance right there. So your back office maintenance end, these are the things you need to do. And then the last but not least is hazmat. You see all this hazmat stuff? If you're a hazmat carrier, you got a lot of violations in blue here that you need to worry about. So in a nutshell, don't violate the acute and critical regulations. What are we here for? Monthly, to answer all your questions so we don't end up in trouble doing this. Now, those are the acute and criticals. What else can get you in trouble? And I'm going to tell you, these are the factors. These are the factors that drive a bad rating. If you violate insurance or the general items, then you have an adverse rating in factor 1. If you violate drug and alcohol, CDLs, or driver qualification, you have an adverse factor 2. If you violate operation on the road and logbooks, it's factor 3. If you have maintenance issues, it's factor 4. If you do hazmat wrong, it's factor 5. Then we have this weird one, your accident factor, your recordable rate. What's that, John? This is something that gets so many companies in trouble. And it's right in this section, factor 6, your accident factor. You see that? Right here, 1.5 and 1.7. If you stay in the city limits, it's 1.7. If you stay within the country and you're not in the city limits, it's 1.5. What is this? This is how many crashes you have per million miles driven. Okay, 1.5. If you exceed 1.5 crashes per million miles driven, out of all the crashes for DOT in the last 365 days versus your mileage in the last 365 days, if you exceed 1.5, you're going to end up with a conditional factor, which will give you a conditional rating. This sucks because if you have too many crashes and not enough miles, you could end up a conditional carrier, even though you violated nothing. You just exceeded this 1.5. Now, the feds are not supposed to apply crashes that are not your fault. So it's important to do data queues for crashes, right? It's important to do data queues for crashes because if you do data queues for crashes, then they show that they're not your fault, and then the feds won't use them in this calculation. If you haven't done your data queues, you can still convince them. It's just a little harder. Where do I see companies getting in trouble? They use their last 4 quarters IFTAs in their questionnaire when the feds come visit them, and they don't give them an accurate mileage amount. They don't realize that understating your mileage during a compliance review could artificially cause your accident rate to exceed 1.5. I had a customer that just called me. In June, they had a review from the feds. They had 35 trucks, but they told the feds they had 1.9 million miles. Why would they do that with 35 trucks? Because they used the last 4 quarters filed IFTAs in their questionnaire. They didn't tell them the last 365 days. So they missed the mileage for the last 3 months that actually had a lot more mileage than the mileage a year ago. So they understated their mileage, exceeded the 1.5. The investigator didn't tell them. They didn't know any better. And long story short, they ended up with a bad rating simply because they misrepresented their own mileage. You got to know what happens in these reviews. So that's the accident factor. The last one is called the vehicle factor. They'll sample your last X number of inspections based on size. And again, we're going to continue to add modules here for these customers. I'm going to explain what is adverse in a given factor to drive your rating in a module. One thing you need to focus on is if your vehicle out of service rate for maintenance roadsides out of the last X number of inspections exceeds 34%, that's one step to having a bad review. So, John, summarize this for me. If they come knock on my door and I want to have a satisfactory rating or a non-rated review, what do I need to worry about? Answer, you need to worry about acute and criticals, which is in section 7 of this regulation. What else do you need to worry about? You need to make sure that you're not exceeding 1.5 crashes per million miles driven. What's the last thing? Make sure your vehicle out of service rate over X number of your most recent inspections doesn't exceed 34%. I think I didn't say that. If you're less than 34%, you'll pass that section. If you're more, you won't. Now, does this mean we want to be at 32%? No. Does this mean we want 1.4 crashes per million miles driven? No. The purpose of this training and these sessions and education is to make it so we're never placed out of service, to make sure that we never crash our vehicles, to make sure that never violate the acute and criticals. However, we also want the feds to come in and find the non-acute and critical regulations good to go. Do we really want to not have a drug testing policy? No. Do we really want to fail to fill out an application in our DQ file? No. The more violations you have, even though they don't hurt your rating, the attorneys that may sue us will come in, see all those violations and say, listen, this isn't a safe company. And then you might say, well, how do they end up getting a copy of your review? Well, it's public record that you underwent one, and a good attorney under discovery will ask for a copy of your last review. If they get a copy of your review and you have 32 non-acute and critical violations, just because you passed the review doesn't really mean that you passed. So what are we doing here with this session? Because there weren't a lot of questions. I wanted you guys to understand what's the difference between a safety audit and a review. I wanted you to understand they have full reviews and they may knock on your door. I want you to understand they have focus reviews. Well, they'll just send you an email and you have to upload documents. You don't want criticals and acutes. You don't want your accident factor high, and you don't want your 34% to be exceeded with their sample of inspections. We don't want any violations. but specifically those.